welcome to our podcast. My name is Callan, and I will be joined by Claudia and Charlotte. Today, we are going to be speaking about the ongoing climate crisis, and more specific to that, we'll be speaking about barriers to climate action, from identity protective cognition or motivated reasoning, the role misinformation plays in our discourse regarding climate action, to how our political affiliations and social identity influence our beliefs regarding anthropogenic climate change. So, I think this is a really pertinent time to be speaking about our attitudes toward climate change and climate action, or lack thereof. Last week we had COP27, where world leaders met to discuss the ongoing climate crisis and what states can do about it. Personally, I feel it's difficult to feel like this is anything other than lip service and political theater, given we are nowhere near meeting the Paris Climate Accords, which were set out 7 years ago and which aim to keep global heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the consensus now is that we're heading for over 2 degrees Celsius or possibly even more than that. And obviously, I think we've seen the acceleration and proliferation of extreme weather events over the last year, from the European heat waves to apocalyptic flooding in Pakistan. And so I think my takeaway from that is that climate change is not something that's going to happen in the distant future, but it's happening all around us right now. So what I'm going to speak about a little bit about first is the role of misinformation in modern climate change discourse and how misinformation can impede action and influence attitudes toward climate change. So, much like the tobacco companies in the 20th century tried to dismiss the harmful effects of smoking, either through political lobbying or misinformation campaigns, fossil fuel companies have also spent billions on quelling the voices of scientists who have raised the alarm on the harmful effects of humanity's use of fossil fuels. There have been a few ways they've gone about doing this. One way is by putting pressure on media outlets and the financial backers of said outlets to report in contrary positions to the scientific consensus. Now, like, we know that essentially 99% of all climate scientists agree that the current state of the climate has undoubtedly been affected by human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, and that pumping millions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere is detrimental to the planet. Um, However, there have been some dissenting voices in the scientific community, and I think it's these contrarian positions that fossil fuel lobbyists have been supporting. And I think the point of this is really to sow doubt and discord in the consensus and to try get people to consider that there is in fact, an alternative point of view. And which, if you look at the literature and the data, it's unequivocal that humans are detrimentally affecting the climate. Another method that's been used is political lobbying. So in the 90s, fossil fuel companies began to heavily support the Republican Party in the United States and to suggest that anthropogenic climate change was a liberal hoax. I think a really telling sign that this lobbying manipulation of conservatives has been successful is a poll conducted in America in the 90s and again in 2008. So the poll from the 90s showed that 80% of Americans believe climate change is a real phenomenon and something should be done to combat it. So, obviously the vast majority of people. However, the poll in 2008 showed that just 48% of Americans now believe climate change is real. So, and you have to think about this in the context that the scientific research and literature documenting the effects human activity has been having on the climate has proliferated since the 90s. And so you would expect, as we become more knowledgeable about this issue, the numbers in the polls would be going up and not down. But I really think this is just indicative of how strong a tool misinformation is and how successful fossil fuel companies have been in using it. And obviously, in recent years, we've seen how partisan and divisive this issue has become, from Donald Trump's criticisms of the Paris Accords and his rollback of climate action initiatives, and of course his incessant tweeting that climate change is a hoax, to Jair Bolsonaro's dismantling of the Amazon. So it seems that financial power and lobbying by fossil fuel firms is more successful and dangerous than ever. You know, but in saying that, I do think governments also need to give clarity on how transitioning to a green society would affect the economy and how we can protect jobs. Because I think this is something that fossil fuel lobbyists and their political actors are really good at, which is preying on legitimate concerns of people. And they have been using this as a hammer to be climate activists with. And I think it's something we do need to address with clarity. Another way misinformation has proliferated is in the case of well respected scientists or formerly well respected scientists who have authored papers skeptical of the consensus, and a multitude of think tanks and other organizations that are funded by fossil fuel companies. And I think they're doing this in order to legitimize climate skepticism. And so I think the main point I'm trying to make, or the takeaway here, is that ideology and financial power are the tools of climate denialism and misinformation, and are really extremely powerful ones. So that kind of concludes my part on misinformation.
I was wondering, what can we do to tackle misinformation?
Yeah, so I think the difficulty in the accessibility of data is something that's the science community needs to address. I think, public education regarding climate change is not something, at least in my experience, that heavily featured on class curriculum. And I think this is also exploited by fossil fuel lobbyists and others who then, deliberately sow confusion and try to obscure the science on the pretext of skepticism. I think, another way we could tackle this, and I think a really important way, is by holding social media companies accountable for the misinformation they allow to proliferate on their feeds. I think they need to invest money into disabling bot accounts funded by fossil fuel companies. And I think one thing that they did do, in credit to them with COVID, was that they kind of noted misinformation and inaccuracies in certain articles and posts. And I think that's really important because I read a recent study that showed climate misinformation is viewed more than 1 million times a day on Facebook alone. So like this is a real issue, but I think there are a couple of ways of combating it. So I think now, Claudia, you're going to speak about kind of like cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning.
Yeah. So first, just to give a definition on what cognitive dissonance is, it's when your actions what you are doing go against your mental belief. And this highly coincides with the climate crisis, as many people do know what the climate crisis is or have an understanding of how their actions affect the climate, and yet their actions don't change. So say driving a car or taking a plane for a vacation or something like that, or even eating habits, like eating meat specifically and stuff like that. Um, and I know it's something that a lot of people experience. I know I definitely have experienced it. Especially I'm from the US, obviously, so I have to take a plane every time I go back and forth between school and home. So it's something that a lot of people go through and experience. And I have this interesting quote from Lewandowski et al. From 2012, and explains that people will seek out groups and information in order to avoid this dissonance, which is very interesting, especially when we connect it to political groups and affiliation. So the quote is, and I feel like this adds another level into what you were talking about, misinformation before, where people will try to seek out groups to be a part of or information that causes them not to feel this cognitive dissonance. And I think it directly correlates to why people, especially in the United States, I feel have these strong political affiliations, but also strong feelings against climate change specifically. And this coincides also with our identity and how people like how people's identities come to be. And it is shown that the groups that people belong to impact how we understand ourselves and the world around us. So this could be political groups or just the people that you know hang around and stuff like that. It can really be, a group can be something that you seek out, or it could be something that's randomly assigned to you. And it's shown that people will stick to that group and have what they say is in-group love rather than out-group hate, which is quite interesting. So in Pavel and Van Backer, the article, it explains that people generally gravitate toward a more social setting. So I feel like in terms of the climate crisis, this can be both beneficial or not. And it furthers explains that we typically find our identities through group settings and our commonalities with others. Therefore, when someone or another group is speaking out against that group, we're prone to deflect rather than reflect. So this could be a bad thing where the climate crisis, if somebody is telling you that you have to change, or you have to change the way that you're acting, or the group that you're a part of, you will want to deflect what they're saying and try to stay within that social group because you identify with it, and it is now part of your identity. So it's much harder to change, which is very interesting. But it can also be a good thing because it goes on to say that we are naturally pro-social rather than pro-self. So we will want to do what is beneficial for society rather than what benefits us individually. So I think that we can learn from our identities, but also we can change. So I think that with the climate crisis, a lot of what we learn about and what we talk about seems very negative, but I think that it can still be quite positive. And in terms of the way that we think, I think that relates a lot to the climate crisis as well. Heuristics are these mental shortcuts or rules of thumb that help us solve problems quickly and efficiently. And we tend to make these snap judgments using heuristics rather than systematically reviewing evidence, which again directly relates to the climate crisis, because people are just making these snap decisions of what they should do in their life and not really thinking about what could happen from it, because it'll reward them sooner, but there will obviously be these causes later that are negative. But something that I think that we can talk about and look forward to a positive kind of solution is that we rely on emotion to make judgments and decisions when faced with uncertainty. So I think that if we bring in kind of this emotional aspect to the climate crisis, we can find a good solution to it. So I think that we can talk about that maybe later as well.
Yeah, so I think like one of the really interesting things that I observed in what you were saying there is that a lot of our discourse around climate change is quite negative, but that, because, we gravitate towards being pro-social and, society has come up with a lot of ingenious methods for solving problems. Like, do you see, like, can you take something positive from that aspect that we can come together and do something about this?
Yeah, I feel like everything that we've been looking at, even though it seems very negative, and it definitely is very negative, if we also connect it to the psychology of who we are naturally and scientifically, we can see that it's not within our nature to try to solve these problems, and to see that if it's beneficial for everybody, that we'll want to do something about that.
Claudia, I was also wondering, with these kind of cognitive barriers in mind, do you think we can almost like manipulate or use these to shape our narrative and our approach to tackling the climate crisis?
Yeah, totally. I feel like if we rely on emotion, for example, we can start having, say, these kind of campaigns on social media or stuff like that, that kind of tries to trigger these emotional responses for us. And I think that, like they were talking about the Syrian crisis and how so many people donated after hearing the story of that one boy, I think it was. If we do something like that, I think that we can manipulate people, which doesn't sound good, but I think it would be beneficial if we do kind of use these barriers in our favor. Totally.
I guess I'm also going to talk a bit about misinformation and the cognitive kind of barriers, and also climate change is kind of a narrative and the emotional appeal and how we can almost manipulate it and use that to shape our response to the climate crisis. So with regards to misinformation, I think sort of going on from what Callan was saying, it's particularly interesting when you imagine sort of misinformation and the link between democracy I think it's quite well sort of established that a well-functioning democracy kind of requires a well-informed populace in order to make sort of effective social change. There's quite a pronounced difference between ignorance and misinformation, in that sort of ignorance is actually a lot more benign, and there's an acknowledgement of kind of uncertainty and an unawareness of an issue, whereas kind of as Claudia discussed, when you have misinformation, people are more, I don't know, they're kind of less inclined to kind of use heuristics, and there's a certainty and conviction in what they believe. And this is particularly kind of pernicious when you look at the current media landscape. News coverage as something that's like continuous and comes out spontaneously is by nature kind of piecemeal, and this creates a lot of room for misinformation, particularly to do with like information around the climate and sort of fueling uncertainty, particularly with sort of money from fossil fuel industries. It leaves a lot of room for misinformation and the manipulation of that. We also have quite a fractionalized information landscape, where there's so much content available that people tend to sort of, when presented with these options, they tend to be more and more biased and lean towards like-minded sources. And this is also sort of manipulated by politicians. This is kind of strategic extremism, where they're able to sort of cater to these kind of extreme niche political opinions without alienating the populaces, because people are in these like quite distinct bubbles of media. And also it's widely quite established that there's a sense of sort of confirmation bias. So even with presented kind of to do with information, even with presented with retractions and corrections and misinformation, it's challenging for people to kind of shift this narrative in their own kind of cognitive perception of these events. So information is a lot more easily accepted when it fits into a coherent narrative that someone's already sort of pre-established and kind of being adverse. When information doesn't fit with that, it's very challenging to sort of change and accept that. So I think, again, sort of linking this to mental models, it's particularly interesting, I think, with climate change. We talk about mental models as a lot of how people sort of perceive information and perceive the climate change. So it explains why misinformation is particularly resilient to correction, even when we're aware of even when we're presented with corrections. I think George Marshall also talks a lot about climate change as a narrative, and this is how like a way in which we can kind of combat it. Because one of the problems with climate change is it kind of lacks this urgency and salience. Even though it is salient, it's quite a gradual process, and it's not one sort of cataclysmic event that's going to like erode our society and our functioning in one event. It's a more gradual, sustained process, and that's just quite challenging for us to cognitively come to terms with. So it kind of lacks these clear, recognizable enemies. But emotionally, enemies are really important because they engage our moral brain and it energizes our kind of outrage. But the reality is that the idea of climate change is actually quite an incomplete and uncompelling narrative. So a means to kind of combat that is to follow quite clear narrative rules, to use quite recognizable actors, motives, causes, and effects. So I think it is quite important that we think about how we present the narrative around climate change, but also be particularly careful, because creating, as Claudia sort of mentioned, the challenge with like an emotional narrative and rhetoric is that it also can create kind of in and out groups. And you have to be quite careful with the way in which we present it.
Thanks for that. I think one observation that I would make there, and I wonder what you think about, or how you think about it, is, this idea that like, individuals, if we just recycled more, or we just, didn't ride on a plane, or we did our, these little things, because what you were saying there about, having a moral enemy, and obviously we've seen with like climate activists and stuff recently, them calling out billionaires to do more, riding on their, politicians riding on their private jets to COP27. Do you think, we need to shift the emphasis away, from blaming individuals, and toward like, creating, and the term enemy is quite loaded, but, having an idea of who is most responsible for these issues?
I don't know. I think it's quite an interesting question. I think George Marshall is kind of in this idea of climate change as a narrative. He kind of discusses it's important to emphasize unity and a kind of collective humanity. And I think that's true, but I don't think it's necessarily particularly effective. I don't think it kind of enrages or fuels action. I think there's a difference between sort of targeting individuals in the sense of like individual responsibility, and then targeting like corporations and those most sort of culpable for the effects of climate change. Because I think there are, even if climate change is sort of a universal collective problem, I think there are people who are far more culpable and responsible. I mean, particularly sort of, even the global north and the south. This is quite a, popular this is widely discussed at the moment, particularly with the floods in Pakistan. But I don't think we're all equally culpable for climate change. I think it makes sense then that we sort of shift our responsibility and blame to certain people. But I think that also has to be sort of, it can't just be sort of blame for the sake of blame. I think it has to come with more sort of clear, concrete action. So I think if we're sort of targeting billionaires or specific sort of corporations, I think it needs to come with a specific like means to combat that, a solution or a sort of remedy for that. What do we propose instead? I think it can't just be sort of a narrative attack, and it has to come with a proposal and like a remedy for it. I think that's a very important balance that's often missed, especially to do again. The problem with a lot of the current contemporary media cycle is it's it's clickbait. It's trying to get attention. The kind of a lot of the really kind of important information around climate change and addressing it just isn't particularly effective. I mean, it's not particularly oh sorry. Could you please edit that out? Let me just rephrase my thoughts. I think the problem with a lot of kind of contemporary information about climate change is a lot of the practical solutions are not particularly like sexy from a media point of view. They're not the most appealing. They're not necessarily the best for consumers. So it's challenging kind of like to have this balance of attack can sometimes garner attention and can get reaction from people, but it also has to sort of weave in this narrative of change and policy.
Yeah, I think
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a really important point you made, and it goes back to what I said in my bit, that there are legitimate concerns among people, like how transitioning our society to a green society, because we're so dependent on fossil fuels, how how we would economically survive that. And I think you know politicians really need to be clear on that. Um, but yeah, I definitely think I would agree with you that we're not all equally culpable, and that those with the broadest shoulders kind of have to do more.
Yeah, no, it is quite complicated. I think it's challenging to sort of frame. I'm very against personally this idea of like personal responsibility for climate change. I really hate the kind of even the sort of shift on our carbon footprint. Obviously this is like very much fueled by the fossil fuel industry. It's really challenging to find that kind of balance, and I think acceptance and sort of culpability is quite challenging to reconcile with, but there's an urgency and there's a need for it. And I think, I don't know, perhaps if we move past this narrative of like kind of shame and culpability, that can actually translate, if that can be translated from just like shame into actual action, and this is what we can do, these are like practical means. I think that's when it becomes effective, and we can again combine this kind of like emotional appeal and something more practical and tangible. I think that's perhaps the most effective way to deal with this.
Yeah, like a balance of having something that catches your attention, but also tells you, now that we have your attention, this is what you can do, or this is something that you should start a conversation about. Maybe just like say a balance, like not everything is um, uh, with the media perspective, trying to catch your attention isn't necessarily the thing that's bad, but once they have your attention, what they do with it.
Exactly. I mean, it's just kind of awareness of how these things function. It's the awareness of how sort of misinformation is propagated in the media, but also sort of how we, can conceive of climate change and tackle it cognitively, and an understanding of these things. If we have awareness of this, we can kind of manipulate them and use them to our advantage, rather than sort of like, accept defeat, or there's such a defeatist narrative around climate change and kind of uncertainty, and it's so complex, and I think it can feel like, I don't know, it can feel so like massive and insurmountable. And there's no way we can practically deal with this, even though there are very practical and tangible things we can do. I think it's challenging. It's taking something that's very complex, and sort of simplifying it and making it more, making it more not palatable, but making it more feasible for everyday people
Yeah.
is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And another thing I think I would take away from this conversation is that, the idea that we need to maybe, I don't know if I would say depoliticize, or at least, and it's quite ambitious to say it, but take, climate science and separate it from ideology, because it's really bizarre that, we have, a left right, you know, such a substantial difference on of opinions. And really, like, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And the facts are telling us that we're in big trouble. And yeah, I think the whole conversation has become so politicized to the point that, as you were talking about, Claudia, it's really tying into people's idea of their personal identities, and it can even have a backfiring effect that people become more entrenched in their ideology, they reject facts that are contrarian to their ideological positions, which I think is obviously a huge issue.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I mean,
agree.
I think it's exactly what it kind of is challenging to strike the balance between appealing to, I think, again, as you said, perhaps that is the other way we solve it, is by appealing to sort of a common humanity. But at the same time, this idea of enemies is very, I think, again, the idea of like people being differently culpable for climate change perhaps also feels into this like political, polarization around the issue. It's a challenging thing to balance. But I agree. I think there does need to be a sort of like larger narrative of, you know, it's a human issue. This is not a political or like ideological issue. This is something it consumes our, the human condition and like our existence on this planet. It's so,
Well, we all share the one planet,
essential.
so whether you identify
Exactly.
as liberal or conservative, left or right, or as I said, like, you can have an opinion, but it doesn't change the facts. So yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, is there anything else to add, or?
I think that's all I had to say, but I think that we can leave this conversation still at least being still having a positive outlook, which I feel like, especially around this conversation, a lot of conversations leave you feeling quite negative. So I hope that we can leave it with just an understanding that it is possible to kind of make this something that everybody worries about.
Yep, I agree. So I think that's it then. Thank you for listening to our podcast.